In the unforgiving world of military training, where ego and pride can cost lives, one moment of arrogance would shatter everything a hardened Marine thought he knew about strength, honor, and what it truly means to serve. What started as a routine insult hurled at a quiet SEAL recruit would spiral into a life-changing encounter that would humble a decorated warrior and reveal the extraordinary person hiding beneath an ordinary exterior. This isn't just another story about military rivalry. It's about the moment when assumptions crumble, when prejudice meets reality, and when one word, idiot, becomes the catalyst for a transformation that neither man saw coming. In a world where respect is earned through blood, sweat, and unwavering determination, two warriors from different worlds were about to discover that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not against enemies, but against our own misconceptions. The Marine thought he knew everything about weakness. The SEAL recruit was about to teach him everything about strength, and in that collision of worlds, both men would emerge forever changed. The scorching heat of Camp Pendleton beat down mercilessly on the training grounds, as Sergeant Marcus "Tank" Rodriguez adjusted his worn Marine Corps cap and surveyed the mixed group of recruits before him. At 32, Tank had seen 3 tours in Afghanistan, earned 2 Purple Hearts, and commanded the respect of every Marine under his supervision. His reputation preceded him wherever he went, a walking legend of discipline, strength, and unwavering dedication to the Corps. Tank's weathered hands bore the scars of countless battles, and his steel-grey eyes had witnessed horrors that would break lesser men. He carried himself with the confident swagger of someone who had proven himself time and again in the crucible of combat. Today, he was overseeing a joint training exercise, something he personally considered a waste of time. Marines didn't need help from anyone, especially not from the other branches that seemed to think they were something special. Among the group of recruits stood a young man who immediately caught Tank's attention, though not for the reasons one might expect. David Chen appeared unremarkable at first glance. Average height, lean build, and a quiet demeanor that seemed almost out of place among the typically aggressive military recruits. What irritated Tank most was the small SEAL trident pin barely visible on David's training uniform. Another hotshot wannabe, Tank thought to himself, probably thinking he was better than everyone else just because he was trying out for the SEALs. The morning drill had been progressing normally until David stumbled during a routine obstacle course run. It wasn't a dramatic fall, just a momentary loss of balance that caused him to catch himself against a wooden barrier. In the grand scheme of things, it was insignificant, the kind of minor mishap that happened to everyone during intense physical training. But Tank saw it as confirmation of what he already believed about SEAL recruits. All hype, no substance. "You idiot!" Tank's voice boomed across the training ground, cutting through the morning air like a knife. Every recruit within 50 yards stopped what they were doing and turned to look. Tank strode purposefully toward David, his boots hitting the ground with military precision.
Is that what they're teaching you SEAL wannabes these days?
How to trip over your own feet. David straightened up slowly, brushing dirt from his hands. His response was quiet, almost respectful. "No excuse, Sergeant. I lost focus for a moment." Tank circled David like a predator sizing up prey. "Lost focus? Son, where I come from, losing focus gets Marines killed. Maybe you should consider transferring to the Coast Guard. I hear they're more your speed." The comment drew nervous chuckles from some of the other recruits, but David remained silent, his expression unchanged. "I've been watching you, Chen," Tank continued, reading the name tape on David's uniform. "You think that little pin makes you special. You think because you're in SEAL training, you're somehow better than the rest of us? Let me tell you something, kid. I've served with real warriors, men who've bled and died for this country. You don't measure up." The confrontation was drawing attention from other training groups. Word spread quickly through the base's informal communication network, and soon Marines and other service members were finding excuses to be in the area. Tank felt the familiar rush of having an audience, feeding off the energy of being the center of attention. He had built his reputation on moments like this, demonstrating Marine superiority and putting overconfident recruits in their place. David remained standing at attention, neither defending himself nor backing down. His silence only seemed to irritate Tank further. "What's wrong, hotshot? Cat got your tongue? Or are you just realizing that you're out of your league?" Captain Sarah Mitchell, the commanding officer overseeing the joint training exercise, noticed the commotion and began making her way toward the group. She had worked with Tank before and knew his tendency to be hard on recruits, but something about this particular confrontation felt different. The intensity in Tank's voice and the growing crowd suggested this was escalating beyond normal training discipline. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Captain Mitchell called out as she approached. "Is there a problem here?" Tank snapped to attention. No problem, ma'am. Just correcting a recruit who seems to think SEAL training makes him untouchable. Captain Mitchell glanced at David, who had remained silent throughout the entire exchange. Recruit Chen, do you have anything to say? David's response was measured and respectful. No, ma'am. Sergeant Rodriguez is well within his rights to correct my performance. The response seemed to surprise both Tank and Captain Mitchell. Most recruits in David's position would either defend themselves aggressively or crumble under the pressure. David's calm acceptance of criticism, despite its harsh delivery, suggested either exceptional discipline or something deeper that neither officer fully understood at that moment. Carry on then, Captain Mitchell said, though she made a mental note to keep an eye on the situation. Something about the dynamic between Tank and David felt unresolved, like a storm building on the horizon. As the crowd dispersed and training resumed, Tank felt a nagging sense that something was off. David's reaction hadn't been what he expected. There was no anger, no wounded pride, no defensive posturing. Instead, there had been a quiet strength that Tank couldn't quite categorize. It was the kind of composure that came from either exceptional training or extraordinary life experience. The rest of the morning passed without incident, but Tank found himself watching David more closely. Despite the earlier stumble, David's performance was solid, not spectacular, but consistently competent. He helped other recruits when they struggled, shared his water during breaks, and maintained his composure even when facing additional scrutiny from the training instructors. During lunch break, Tank overheard a conversation between two Navy instructors discussing David. What he learned made him pause mid-bite of his sandwich. David Chen wasn't just another SEAL recruit trying to prove himself. He was already a decorated Navy veteran with multiple deployments under his belt, currently going through additional specialized training. The stumble that morning had occurred after David had spent the previous 18 hours awake, having volunteered for extra night training exercises that most other recruits had declined. Tank felt a strange twist in his stomach. The idiot he had humiliated in front of dozens of his peers was actually a combat veteran with a service record that would impress any Marine. But Tank pushed the feeling aside. So what if the kid had some experience? That didn't change the fact that he had shown weakness in front of other Marines, and Tank's response had been appropriate. As the afternoon training session began, Tank noticed that David was moving with slightly less fluidity than before. A closer look revealed that David was favoring his left leg, likely the result of an old injury aggravated by the morning's intense training. Despite this, David continued to push through every exercise, never asking for special consideration or medical attention. The revelation about David's background continued to nag at Tank throughout the day. He prided himself on being able to read people, on knowing who belonged in the military and who didn't. But David didn't fit into any of the categories Tank typically used to judge recruits. He wasn't the cocky show-off Tank had initially assumed, nor was he the weak link that the morning stumble had suggested. As evening approached and the day's training came to an end, Tank found himself at a crossroads. His pride as a Marine and his reputation among his peers demanded that he maintain his stance. David had shown weakness, and Tank had responded appropriately. But a growing voice in the back of his mind suggested that there might be more to this story than he had initially understood. The sun was setting over Camp Pendleton, casting long shadows across the training grounds. Most of the recruits had headed to Chow or back to their barracks, but David remained on the obstacle course, running through the same section where he had stumbled that morning. Tank watched from a distance as David repeated the sequence over and over, each time with slightly better form, slightly more precision. There was something almost meditative about David's approach to the training. No anger, no frustration, just quiet determination to improve. Tank had seen thousands of recruits over his career, and most of them responded to failure with either explosive emotion or complete defeat. David's methodical approach to self-improvement was something Tank hadn't encountered before. As Tank prepared to leave for the day, he made a decision that would surprise him later. Instead of heading home or to the NCO club for drinks with the other Marines, he decided to stick around and observe David's solo training session. Something about the young SEAL recruit had captured his attention in a way that went beyond simple curiosity. The stage was set for a confrontation that would challenge everything Tank thought he knew about strength, leadership, and what it meant to be a warrior. But neither man realized that the events of the following day would fundamentally change both of their lives forever. Tank Rodriguez, the hardened Marine who had never backed down from a fight and never questioned his own judgment, was about to learn that sometimes the most important battles are the ones that force us to confront our own assumptions. And David Chen, the quiet professional who had absorbed Tank's insult with grace, was carrying secrets that would soon reshape everything Tank believed about courage, sacrifice, and the true meaning of heroism. The confrontation was just the beginning. Tomorrow would bring revelations that would humble a proud Marine and reveal the extraordinary character of a man he had dismissed as an idiot. Tank Rodriguez couldn't shake the image of David Chen running those obstacles alone in the fading light. Something about the recruit's methodical determination had burrowed under his skin, creating an itch he couldn't quite scratch. Tank had built his entire identity around being able to size up people instantly, separating the warriors from the pretenders with a glance. But David defied easy classification, and that bothered Tank more than he cared to admit. The next morning arrived with the typical chaos of military training. Tank was reviewing the day's schedule when Master Chief Petty Officer James Bull Thompson approached his desk. Bull was a Navy SEAL instructor with 25 years of service, a man whose reputation for producing elite warriors was legendary throughout the special operations community. Tank respected Bull, despite their different branches, because the man had earned his stripes in the same crucible of combat that Tank knew so well.
Tank, we need to talk, Bull said, his voice carrying the weight of serious business.
I heard about what happened yesterday with one of my guys. Tank leaned back in his chair, already feeling defensive. Which guy? We had about 40 recruits out there yesterday. David Chen, the one you called an idiot in front of half the base. Tank's jaw tightened. The kid screwed up. I corrected him. That's how this works, Bull. Your boy needs to learn that SEAL training doesn't make him immune to criticism. Bull pulled up a chair and sat down heavily. Tank, what do you know about David Chen's background? I know he's a SEAL wannabe who thinks he's hot stuff because he's got a trident pin. Probably some college boy who watched too many movies and thinks special ops is going to be fun. Bull's weathered face showed no emotion, but Tank caught something in his eyes. Disappointment, maybe pity. David Chen is a Navy Cross recipient. He single-handedly saved an entire Marine unit in Kandahar 3 years ago. Tank's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. The Navy Cross was the second highest military decoration for valor, just below the Medal of Honor. It wasn't something given out lightly or to anyone who wasn't an absolute hero. Bull, if you're trying to... Let me finish, Bull interrupted. David was part of a joint operation with your boys from 2nd Battalion. Intelligence had gone bad, and what was supposed to be a routine patrol turned into a nightmare. 30 Marines pinned down by enemy fire, completely cut off from support. Tank set his coffee down, giving Bull his full attention. He had heard stories about Kandahar from the guys who served there, and none of them were pleasant.
David was with a small SEAL reconnaissance team about 2 clicks away when they heard the distress call.
Command ordered them to hold position and wait for reinforcement. David disobeyed direct orders, left his team, and infiltrated enemy positions alone. Spent 14 hours behind enemy lines, taking out sniper nests and creating diversions that allowed those Marines to execute a fighting withdrawal. Tank felt something cold settling in his stomach. Bull, he took shrapnel in 3 places, including a piece that's still lodged near his spine. The doctors said removing it could paralyze him, so he chose to leave it there and continue serving. The limp you probably noticed, that's not from clumsiness, Tank. That's from dragging wounded Marines to safety under enemy fire. The revelation hit Tank like a physical blow. The stumble he had witnessed yesterday, the one that had prompted his verbal assault, was the result of an injury sustained while saving the lives of men Tank had trained, men who wore the same uniform he wore every day. Bull continued, his voice growing quieter but more intense. The citation for his Navy Cross specifically mentions his actions in saving the lives of 34 Marines from 2nd Battalion. Marines who went home to their families because David Chen was willing to risk everything for brothers he had never met. Tank's mind raced back to the previous day. David's calm acceptance of criticism, his refusal to defend himself or explain his stumble, his quiet determination during the solo training session. All of it took on new meaning. David could have shut down Tank's verbal assault with a single sentence about his service record, but he had chosen to remain silent. Why didn't he say anything? Tank asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Because that's who David is. The kid doesn't wear his heroism on his sleeve. He's here for additional SEAL training because he requested assignment to an even more dangerous unit. Says he wants to be where he can do the most good for his fellow service members. Bull pulled a folded paper from his pocket and placed it on Tank's desk. This is a letter from Colonel Martinez, commanding officer of 2nd Battalion. He wrote it after David's actions in Kandahar. Thought you might want to read it. Tank unfolded the letter with hands that weren't quite steady. The official letterhead of the Marine Corps stared back at him as he read. Petty Officer David Chen demonstrated extraordinary heroism and selfless devotion to duty in the face of overwhelming enemy forces. His actions directly resulted in the survival of 34 Marines who would have otherwise been lost. His courage under fire and willingness to sacrifice himself for Marines he had never met exemplifies the finest traditions of military service. Every Marine in 2nd Battalion owes their life to this young sailor's heroic actions. Tank read the letter twice, each word driving home the magnitude of his mistake. He had called a genuine war hero an idiot in front of dozens of people. But more than that, he had done it to a man who had literally bled for the Marines Tank claimed to represent. "There's more," Bull said quietly. "David's not just going through routine SEAL training. He's being evaluated for a special assignment that would put him in charge of training joint military units in advanced combat techniques. The performance evaluations from this training exercise will partially determine whether he gets that assignment." Tank's heart sank further. His public humiliation of David could potentially impact the man's career prospects. "Bull, I had no idea. If I had known..." "That's exactly the problem, Tank. You didn't know, but you made assumptions anyway. You saw what you expected to see instead of really looking at who was in front of you." Bull stood up, preparing to leave. "David doesn't know I'm here talking to you. He specifically asked me not to intervene on his behalf. Said he could handle whatever came his way during training, and that his service record should speak for itself through his actions, not through other people defending him." After Bull left, Tank sat alone in his office, staring at Colonel Martinez's letter. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him like physical force. He had built his reputation on being a leader who recognized talent and pushed people to be their best. Instead, he had publicly humiliated a hero based on nothing more than prejudice and assumptions. Tank's phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed it was his wife Maria, calling from their home in nearby Oceanside. "Hey, honey." Maria's voice was warm and familiar. "How's your day going?" Tank normally shared everything with Maria, but today he found himself hesitating. How could he explain that he had spent the previous day attacking the character of a man who exemplified everything Tank claimed to value? "It's been educational," he finally said. "That sounds ominous. Want to talk about it?" Tank looked again at the letter on his desk. "Maria, have you ever been completely wrong about someone? I mean, not just misunderstood them, but being totally off base about who they were as a person." There was a pause. "Marcus, what happened? This doesn't sound like you." Tank told her the whole story, his confrontation with David, Bull's revelations about David's heroic service record, and the growing realization that he had made a terrible mistake based on his own prejudices. Maria listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Tank loved most about her. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Marcus," she finally said, "you've always prided yourself on being a good judge of character. Maybe this is an opportunity to become an even better one." "How do you mean?" "You made a mistake based on assumptions. Now you have a choice. You can let your pride keep you from doing what's right, or you can find a way to make this better. The Marcus Rodriguez I married would find a way to make it better." After hanging up with Maria, Tank spent the rest of the morning thinking about Bull's words and his wife's advice. By noon, he had made a decision that would require him to do something he had rarely done in his military career: publicly admit he had been wrong. Tank found David during the lunch break, sitting alone and reading what appeared to be a technical manual on advanced weapons systems. David looked up as Tank approached, his expression neutral and respectful. "Recruit Chen, I need to speak with you." David closed the manual and stood. "Yes, Sergeant." Tank gestured toward a bench under a nearby tree, away from the other recruits. "Sit down, son. This is off the record." David remained standing. "If it's all the same to you, Sergeant, I prefer to stand." Tank realized that David was maintaining military courtesy even in what Tank had intended to be an informal conversation. It was another small indicator of David's character that Tank had missed before. "Chen, I owe you an apology," Tank began, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. "I learned some things today about your service record that I should have known before I opened my mouth yesterday." David's expression didn't change. "Sergeant, you don't owe me any explanations. You saw a performance issue and addressed it. That's your job." "No, that's not what happened," Tank said firmly. "What happened was, I made assumptions about you based on nothing but my own prejudices. I called you an idiot without knowing anything about who you are or what you've done for this country." For the first time since Tank had known him, David's composure seemed to crack slightly. "Sergeant, really, it's not necessary." "Yes, it is necessary," Tank interrupted. "David, can I call you David?" David nodded. "David, I spent yesterday thinking you were some hotshot recruit who needed to be taken down a peg. Today I found out you're a Navy Cross recipient who saved the lives of 34 Marines. Men who wear the same uniform I wear. Men who went home to their families because you were willing to risk everything for them." Tank paused, struggling with words that didn't come easily to a man accustomed to projecting strength and certainty. I've served 3 tours and seen my share of heroes. Real heroes, not the Hollywood kind. And yesterday I called one of them an idiot in front of half the base. That's not who I want to be as a Marine, or as a leader. David was quiet for a long moment, studying Tank's face. Sergeant, can I ask you something? Anything. Why are you telling me this? Tank thought about the question. Because I was wrong, and being wrong doesn't get better by pretending it didn't happen, because you deserved better from me as a fellow service member. And because I think I can learn something from you about what it means to be a professional, David extended his hand. Thank you, Sergeant. That took courage to say. As Tank shook David's hand, he realized that this conversation was just the beginning. He had started to make amends for his mistake, but there was still the matter of David's public humiliation the previous day. Tank's apology was private. His insult had been very public. If he truly wanted to make things right, he would need to find a way to address that imbalance. The 2 men talked for another 10 minutes, and Tank found himself genuinely impressed by David's maturity and perspective. David harbored no resentment about the previous day's incident and seemed genuinely focused only on successfully completing his training and moving forward with his military career. As they walked back toward the training area, Tank made another decision. Making a private apology was the right first step, but it wasn't enough. David Chen deserved better than that, and Tank's sense of honor demanded more than private redemption. The afternoon would bring opportunities Tank hadn't anticipated, chances to demonstrate that true leadership sometimes meant humbling yourself in service of something greater than your own pride. The afternoon sun blazed overhead. As Tank Rodriguez prepared for what would be the most difficult moment of his military career, word had spread through the base about Tank's private conversation with David Chen, though the details remained unknown to most. Tank could feel the curious stares of other Marines as he walked across the training ground, their expressions a mixture of confusion and anticipation. Tank had spent the previous hour making phone calls and arranging for something unprecedented. He had requested that all available personnel from the morning's joint training exercise be assembled for what he termed an important announcement regarding training standards. Captain Mitchell had approved the request, though she had pressed Tank for details he wasn't ready to provide. As Tank stood before the assembled group of Marines, Navy personnel, and other service members, he felt a familiar knot in his stomach. This wasn't the nervous tension that came before combat. Tank had faced enemy fire without flinching. This was something far more challenging for a man of his pride and position. The prospect of admitting a fundamental mistake in front of his peers and subordinates. David Chen stood in formation with the other recruits, his expression giving no indication that he knew what was coming. Tank had specifically not told David about his intentions, wanting the moment to be genuine rather than rehearsed. Captain Mitchell stood to the side, her face showing professional curiosity mixed with concern about what her senior sergeant was about to do. "Ladies and gentlemen," Tank began, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled formation. "Yesterday morning, during our training exercise, I publicly corrected a recruit for what I perceived as a performance failure. I called him an idiot in front of many of you, and I did so in a manner that was intended to humiliate and demean." A murmur ran through the formation. This wasn't the typical military briefing anyone had expected. Tank pressed on, his voice growing stronger with each word. "What I didn't know at the time, what I should have taken the time to learn before opening my mouth, was that the recruit I was berating is Petty Officer David Chen, a Navy Cross recipient who single-handedly saved the lives of 34 Marines in Afghanistan."
The murmur grew louder, and Tank could see heads turning toward David, who stood perfectly still, looking straight ahead.
Tank's next words cut through the noise like a blade. "I called a genuine war hero an idiot because he stumbled during an obstacle course run. What I didn't know was that his stumble was caused by shrapnel still lodged in his body from wounds sustained while saving Marines' lives. What I didn't know was that I was looking at a man who embodies everything we claim to value as military professionals." Tank's voice grew more intense, but not with anger, with something that sounded like conviction mixed with remorse. "I want to be very clear about what happened here. This wasn't a training mistake or a communication breakdown. This was a failure of leadership on my part. I made assumptions based on prejudice rather than taking the time to know the man I was dealing with. I let my own biases cloud my judgment, and I publicly humiliated a service member who deserved my respect and admiration." Captain Mitchell's expression had shifted from curiosity to something approaching awe. In her 15 years of service, she had never witnessed a senior non-commissioned officer publicly acknowledge such a fundamental error in judgment. Tank turned to face David directly. "Petty Officer Chen, would you please step forward?" David moved with crisp military precision, stopping 3 feet in front of Tank and snapping to attention. Tank could see the confusion in David's eyes, though his military bearing remained perfect. "Petty Officer Chen," Tank said, his voice now loud enough for everyone to hear clearly. "I owe you a public apology. Yesterday I called you an idiot. Today I know that the only idiot in that exchange was me. I apologize for my unprofessional conduct, for my failure to show you the respect you had earned through your service to this country, and for embarrassing you in front of your fellow service members." Tank paused, then continued with words that came from a place deeper than military protocol. "More than that, I want everyone here to know what kind of man they're serving alongside. David Chen risked his life to save Marines he had never met. He disobeyed direct orders because he believed saving American lives was more important than following protocol. He spent 14 hours behind enemy lines, taking enemy fire and sustaining injuries that still affect him today, all so that 34 Marines could go home to their families." The training ground had gone completely silent. Even the California wind seemed to have stilled as Tank continued. "I've served 3 tours and worked with some of the finest warriors this country has ever produced. David Chen ranks among the very best of them. He didn't tell you this himself because he's the kind of professional who lets his actions speak louder than his words, but his actions have spoken loudly enough to earn him the Navy Cross, and they speak to the kind of character that makes the rest of us better just by being around it." Tank extended his hand toward David. "Thank you for your service, Petty Officer Chen. Thank you for saving Marine lives. And thank you for showing more class in response to my stupidity than I deserved." David shook Tank's hand, his expression showing both surprise and respect. "Thank you, Sergeant Rodriguez. That took real courage." As the 2 men shook hands, something unexpected happened. One of the Marines in the formation began clapping. Within seconds, the applause had spread throughout the entire group, growing into something that felt more like a celebration than a military formation. Captain Mitchell stepped forward, recognizing that this moment required official acknowledgement. "Formation attention," she called out. The applause died instantly as everyone snapped back to military bearing. "What we've witnessed here today," Captain Mitchell announced, "is an example of leadership at its finest. Sergeant Rodriguez has demonstrated that true strength lies not in never making mistakes, but in having the courage to acknowledge them and make them right. Petty Officer Chen has demonstrated the kind of grace under pressure that exemplifies the finest traditions of military service." She paused, looking first at Tank, then at David. "Both of these men have shown us something important today about integrity, respect, and what it means to serve with honor. I want everyone here to remember this moment, not because of the mistake that was made, but because of the courage it took to make it right." Captain Mitchell dismissed the formation, but few people moved immediately. Small groups began forming around both Tank and David, as service members who had witnessed the exchange wanted to offer their own words of respect and appreciation. Master Chief Thompson approached Tank with a slight smile on his weathered face. "Tank, that was one hell of a thing you just did." "It was the right thing to do," Tank replied. "Should have been done sooner." "Maybe," Bull said. "But doing it at all puts you in pretty rare company. Most people would have just let it slide and hoped everyone forgot about it." As the crowd began to disperse, Tank found himself in conversation with several Marines who wanted to know more about David's service record. Tank realized that his public acknowledgement of David's heroism had done more than just correct his own mistake. It had properly introduced David to the Marine community as someone worthy of their deepest respect. Later that evening, Tank received a phone call from Colonel Martinez, the commanding officer whose letter about David's heroism Bull had shown him earlier. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Colonel Martinez began, "I heard about what you did today. I wanted to call personally to tell you how much I respect what you did." Tank was surprised to hear from such a senior officer about the day's events. "Sir, I just corrected a mistake I should never have made in the first place. Sergeant, I've been in the Corps for 22 years, and I can count on one hand the number of times I've seen someone publicly acknowledge that kind of error in judgment. What you did today took more courage than most people show in combat. David Chen saved 34 of my Marines, and seeing him receive the recognition he deserves means a great deal to me personally." Colonel Martinez continued, "I'm going to be making some calls about David's upcoming assignment evaluation. What happened yesterday shouldn't have any negative impact on his career prospects, and what happened today should definitely count in his favor." After hanging up, Tank sat in his office reflecting on the day's events. His decision to publicly apologize had started as a matter of personal honor, an attempt to make right a wrong he had committed. But the ripple effects had extended far beyond his original intentions. David's heroic service record was now known throughout the base, his reputation enhanced rather than damaged by the events of the past 2 days. Tank's phone buzzed with a text message from his wife, Maria. Heard through the base-wide network about what you did today. I'm proud of you. See you at home. As Tank prepared to leave for the day, he encountered David in the hallway outside the administrative offices. David was carrying a folder of what appeared to be assignment paperwork. David, Tank called out. How are you doing after today? David turned, a genuine smile on his face. Actually, Sergeant, I wanted to thank you again. What you did today was more than I expected or deserved. You deserved a lot more than that, Tank replied. How's the assignment evaluation going? Better than expected, David said. Apparently word has gotten around about the past couple of days. I've had 3 different officers tell me they're putting in recommendations for the special assignment I'm hoping for. Tank felt a warm satisfaction. That's outstanding. You've earned every bit of it. David hesitated, then said something that surprised Tank Tark. Sergeant, can I ask you something personal? Go ahead. Yesterday, when you called me out for that stumble, you were doing your job. You saw what looked like a performance issue, and you addressed it. The way you addressed it was harsh, but this is a harsh business we're in. I never took it personally, and I want you to know that. Tank studied David's face, seeing nothing but sincerity. That means a lot to me, David, but I still should have handled it better. Maybe, David said, but what you did today, that showed me something about who you are as a leader. You could have just let it go, maybe made a quiet apology, and moved on. Instead, you put your own reputation on the line to do what was right. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. The 2 men stood in comfortable silence for a moment. 2 warriors from different backgrounds who had found mutual respect through an unlikely sequence of events. David, Tank said finally, I'd like to buy you dinner sometime. Off base, away from all this military protocol. I'd like to hear some of your stories, if you're willing to share them. I'd like that, Sergeant. But can I make a suggestion? Sure. Why don't you bring your wife? I've heard she's pretty amazing, and I'd like to meet the woman who helped raise such a stand-up guy. Tank laughed, the first genuinely relaxed moment he'd had in 2 days. David, you've got yourself a deal. As Tank drove home that evening, he reflected on how dramatically his perspective had changed in just 2 days. He had started the week confident in his ability to judge people and situations. He was ending it with a humbling lesson in the dangers of assumptions and the power of honest acknowledgement when those assumptions proved wrong. But more than that, Tank had gained something he hadn't expected, a deeper understanding of what leadership really meant. True leadership wasn't about being right all the time. It was about having the courage to be honest when you were wrong and the wisdom to learn from those moments of failure. The encounter with David Chin had challenged Tank's assumptions about strength, heroism, and what it meant to serve with honor. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities to apply the lessons he had learned, but Tank felt better prepared to meet them with both confidence and humility. 3 weeks after Tank Rodriguez's public apology, the dynamics at Camp Pendleton had shifted in ways no one could have predicted. The story of the Marine sergeant who humbled himself before a Navy SEAL hero had spread throughout the base and beyond, becoming the kind of tale that gets retold in military circles for its lessons about leadership, humility, and honor. Tank found himself navigating an unexpected transformation in his own reputation. Rather than damaging his standing among his fellow Marines, his public acknowledgement of error had elevated him in the eyes of many. Young Marines began seeking him out for advice, not just about military matters, but about leadership and personal accountability. Senior officers who had known Tank for years began viewing him with new respect. The change wasn't just external. Tank himself was experiencing a profound shift in how he approached his role as a leader and mentor. The incident with David Chen had forced him to examine his own biases and assumptions in ways that were uncomfortable but ultimately liberating. He found himself listening more carefully to the recruits under his supervision, taking time to understand their backgrounds and motivations before making judgments about their character or potential. David Chen had received his assignment to the Special Joint Training Unit, a position that would put him in charge of developing advanced combat techniques for multi-service teams. The assignment was prestigious and challenging, exactly the kind of role that David's unique combination of combat experience and tactical brilliance made him perfect for. But perhaps more importantly for David, it meant he would be able to serve in a capacity that maximized his ability to protect and prepare other service members. Tank had kept his promise about dinner, and the evening he and Maria had spent with David had become one of the most memorable of Tank's military career. David had shared stories of his deployments that revealed not just his tactical skills, but his deep commitment to the welfare of every service member around him. Maria had been charmed by David's humor and humility, and had told Tank afterward that she understood why the young SEAL had made such an impression on him. The dinner conversation had revealed aspects of David's background that Tank found both inspiring and humbling. David had grown up in a working-class family in San Francisco, the son of immigrants who had sacrificed everything to give their children opportunities in America. His decision to join the military hadn't been driven by adventure or career ambition, but by a profound sense of gratitude to the country that had welcomed his family and a desire to serve something larger than himself. David's description of the action in Afghanistan that had earned him the Navy Cross had been delivered with characteristic understatement. To hear David tell it, he had simply done what anyone in his position would have done when fellow Americans were in danger. Tank recognized this as the hallmark of genuine heroism, the inability to see one's own actions as anything more than duty fulfilled. But the evening had also revealed something about David that Tank found particularly admirable. Despite his heroic service record and growing reputation within the special operations community, David remained focused on continuous improvement and learning. He asked Tank detailed questions about Marine training methods, genuinely interested in understanding how different branches approach the development of warriors. David's humility and intellectual curiosity reminded Tank of why he had joined the military in the first place, not for personal glory, but for the opportunity to be part of something meaningful and to constantly become better than he was. The friendship that developed between Tank and David in the weeks following their initial confrontation became something unique in both men's military experience. Despite their different backgrounds and service branches, they discovered a shared commitment to excellence and a similar philosophy about the responsibility that came with military leadership. They began meeting regularly for coffee or lunch, conversations that ranged from tactical discussions to philosophical debates about the nature of service and sacrifice. Tank's wife Maria became fond of David as well, often inviting him for dinner at their home near the base. She appreciated his respectful manner and dry sense of humor, but more than that, she recognized the positive influence he was having on her husband. Tank had always been a good Marine and a good man, but his friendship with David was bringing out qualities of reflection and humility that made him an even better leader. One evening, about a month after their first encounter, Tank and David were sitting on Tank's back patio, sharing beers and watching the California sunset. Maria had gone inside to take a phone call from her sister, leaving the two men alone with their thoughts. "Tank," David said, breaking a comfortable silence, "can I ask you something that's been on my mind?" "Shoot." "Why do you think our first meeting happened the way it did? I mean, obviously you didn't know my background, but even setting that aside, what was it about me that triggered such a strong reaction from you?" Tank considered the question carefully. It was something he had been thinking about himself, trying to understand the roots of his initial prejudice against David. "Honestly," Tank said, "I think I was threatened by you." David looked surprised. "Threatened? How?" Tank took a long drink of his beer, gathering his thoughts. "David, I've built my entire identity around being a Marine. Everything I am, everything I believe about myself, comes from that foundation. When I see someone from another branch, especially someone going through elite training, there's a part of me that automatically sees them as competition, or as somehow questioning the value of what I represent." He paused, looking out at the darkening sky. "When you stumbled during that obstacle course, it was like my prejudices had been confirmed. Here was this SEAL wannabe proving that Marines were tougher, better prepared, more reliable. It fed every bias I had about other branches." David nodded thoughtfully. "I can understand that. Every service branch has that kind of pride and protectiveness about their identity. But here's the thing I've realized," Tank continued. "That kind of thinking is not just wrong, it's dangerous. It keeps us from recognizing excellence wherever it comes from. It makes us smaller instead of bigger. You didn't threaten what made me valuable as a Marine. You showed me what I could become if I was willing to learn from the best, regardless of what uniform they wore." David was quiet for a moment. "You know, Tank, I have to admit something too. When you called me out that day, part of me was angry. Not because of the criticism, that was fair based on what you saw, but because I felt like I was being judged for something beyond my control. The injury from Afghanistan? Exactly. There are days when the shrapnel in my back makes everything harder. The limp isn't constant, but it shows up when I'm tired or when I've been pushing hard for a long time. I've had to work twice as hard as everyone else just to meet the same standards, and sometimes I fall short despite giving everything I have." Tank felt a familiar stab of regret. "David, I'm sorry. I should have—" "No, let me finish," David interrupted gently. What I realized after our conversation was that you didn't know any of that, and it wasn't your job to know it. You saw what looked like a performance issue, and you addressed it. The problem wasn't your response, it was my sensitivity about being judged for something I couldn't control. David leaned forward in his chair. But what you taught me with your apology was that real strength lies in being willing to reassess and adjust when new information becomes available. You could have stuck to your guns, insisted that your response was appropriate based on what you knew at the time. Instead, you chose to acknowledge that there was more to the story than you had originally understood. Tank felt a warm satisfaction at David's words, but also a continued sense of responsibility. David, I want you to know that what happened between us changed how I approach leadership. I'm more careful now about making assumptions. I take more time to understand the people I'm working with before I form judgments about their capabilities or character. That's exactly what I hoped would come out of all this, David replied. Not that you'd become less demanding or less focused on excellence, but that you'd become more thoughtful about how you pursue those goals. Maria returned from her phone call, carrying a fresh beer for each man. Sorry about that. My sister is dealing with some drama with her teenage kids. What are you two talking about so seriously? Just reflecting on how much things have changed since we met, David said with a smile. Maria settled into a chair between them. Well, I can tell you that Tank's been different since all this happened. More thoughtful, more self-aware. And I mean that in the best possible way. Tank reached over and squeezed Maria's hand. Having you both in my life makes me want to be better than I was. The conversation continued into the evening, ranging over topics from family to career goals to philosophical questions about service and sacrifice. As the night grew late and David prepared to leave, Tank felt grateful for the unexpected friendship that had emerged from such an unpromising beginning. David, Tank said as they shook hands goodbye, I want you to know that calling you an idiot was the best mistake I ever made. David laughed.
Tank, getting called an idiot by you was one of the best things that ever happened to me.
It led to a friendship I never expected, and lessons I'll carry for the rest of my career. As Tank watched David drive away, he reflected on the remarkable transformation that had occurred in just a few weeks. A moment of prejudice and poor judgment had been transformed into a catalyst for personal growth and an unexpected friendship. The incident had taught him that true leadership required not just strength and decisiveness, but humility and the willingness to admit when you were wrong. Tank's transformation wasn't complete. It was an ongoing process that would continue throughout his military career and beyond. But the foundation had been laid for a different kind of leadership, one based on respect for excellence, wherever it was found, and the courage to acknowledge and learn from mistakes. The encounter with David Chen had changed Tank Rodriguez from a good Marine into a great leader, and that transformation was just beginning to ripple outward, affecting every Marine who served under Tank's command and every leader who observed his example. The stage was set for a final chapter that would demonstrate the lasting impact of their unlikely friendship and the lessons they had learned together about honor, respect, and the true meaning of service. 6 months after the confrontation that changed everything, Tank Rodriguez stood before a packed auditorium at the Marine Corps Leadership Academy in Quantico, Virginia. He had been invited to speak about leadership and accountability, a topic that had taken on profound personal meaning since his encounter with David Chen. The audience consisted of senior non-commissioned officers from all branches of the military, men and women who would shape the next generation of military leaders. Tank's reputation had evolved dramatically in the months since his public apology to David. Word of his willingness to acknowledge error and make amends had spread throughout military leadership circles, earning him recognition not as someone who had made a mistake, but as someone who had demonstrated exceptional character in how he handled that mistake. The invitation to speak at Quantico was both an honor and an opportunity to share lessons that had transformed his own approach to leadership. As Tank looked out at the sea of uniformed faces, he thought about David Chen, who was currently deployed with his Special Joint Training Unit to an undisclosed location in the Middle East. David's unit was responsible for training elite forces from allied nations, work that was both dangerous and vital to international security efforts. Before his deployment, David had stopped by to visit Tank and Maria, a dinner that had become a cherished memory for both families. Tank began his presentation with a simple statement that captured the attention of every person in the room. I want to tell you about the day I called a Navy Cross recipient an idiot, and how that mistake became the most valuable lesson of my military career. The story Tank told was honest and unflinching. He described his initial prejudices, his assumptions about David, and the public humiliation he had inflicted on a genuine war hero. But more importantly, he described the process of learning from that mistake and the transformation it had sparked in his approach to leadership. Leadership isn't about being right all the time. Tank told the audience. It's about having the courage to be wrong when the facts demand it, and the wisdom to learn from those moments of failure.
The day I apologized to David Chen in front of half my base wasn't the day I showed weakness. It was the day I finally understood what strength really means.
Tank's presentation included specific examples of how his experience with David had changed his leadership style.
He described taking more time to understand the backgrounds and motivations of the Marines under his command. He talked about creating an environment where excellence was recognized regardless of its source, and where mistakes were viewed as learning opportunities rather than failures to be punished. David Chen taught me that heroism comes in many forms, Tank continued. Sometimes it's the obvious kind, charging into enemy fire to save lives, earning medals for valor under extreme conditions. But sometimes it's quieter, having the grace to accept criticism with dignity, choosing to respond to prejudice with professionalism, maintaining focus on mission accomplishment even when facing unfair treatment. Tank described the friendship that had developed between him and David, emphasizing how learning from someone he had initially dismissed had made him a better leader and a better person. He talked about the conversations they had shared, the different perspectives David had offered on training and leadership, and the mutual respect that had grown between them despite their very different backgrounds. The most important thing David taught me, Tank said, was that true strength lies not in never making mistakes, but in how you respond when you realize you've made one. He could have destroyed my reputation with a single sentence about his service record. Instead, he chose to respond with grace and professionalism that made both of us better. During the question and answer session that followed, Tank was struck by the thoughtful nature of the questions from his audience. These were experienced military leaders who recognized the depth and significance of the lessons Tank was sharing. Many of them had their own stories of moments when pride or assumptions had led them astray, and Tank's willingness to share his experience gave them permission to examine their own leadership styles more critically. One question came from a Navy commander who asked about the long-term impact of Tank's experience. Sergeant Rodriguez, how has this experience continued to influence your leadership style months later? Tank considered the question carefully. Ma'am, every day I have to make decisions about how to evaluate performance, how to provide feedback, and how to develop the Marines under my command. David's influence shows up in all of those areas. I take more time to understand context before making judgments. I'm more focused on understanding the whole person rather than just evaluating isolated performance incidents. And I'm much more aware of my own biases and assumptions. Tank paused, then continued. But perhaps most importantly, I've learned that admitting when you're wrong doesn't make you a weaker leader. It makes you a more trusted one. The Marines I work with know that I'm willing to acknowledge my mistakes and learn from them, which makes them more willing to take risks, admit their own errors, and focus on continuous improvement rather than just avoiding criticism. After the presentation, Tank was approached by several officers who wanted to discuss his experiences in more detail. Among them was Colonel Patricia Hayes, the commanding officer of a Marine training unit who had heard about Tank's story through military networks. Sergeant Rodriguez, Colonel Hayes said, I've been following your career since the incident with Petty Officer Chen. I have to tell you that what you did, both the apology and the way you've applied the lessons since then, has influenced how I approach leadership in my own unit. Tank was surprised and honored to hear this. How so, ma'am? I've instituted a practice in my command where we regularly discuss mistakes and lessons learned. Not as a way to assign blame, but as a way to continuously improve. Your example showed me that creating an environment where people can admit errors and learn from them makes everyone stronger. Colonel Hayes continued, I'd like to invite you to visit my unit and share your experience with my Marines. I think they could benefit from hearing directly from someone who has lived these lessons. Tank agreed, recognizing that sharing his story was becoming an important part of his own continued growth as a leader. Each time he told the story, he gained new insights into the lessons it contained and found new ways to apply those lessons to current challenges. Later that evening, Tank called Maria from his hotel room to tell her about the day's events. She listened with pride as he described the positive response to his presentation and the opportunities that were emerging for him to influence military leadership development. Marcus, Maria said, I'm so proud of what you've become through all of this. But I want you to know that the man who had the courage to make that public apology was already inside you. David didn't create that character, he just gave you the opportunity to show it. Tank felt a familiar warmth at his wife's words. I love you, Maria. Thank you for supporting me through all of this. Always, she replied. Now tell me, have you heard from David lately? Tank had received an email from David just the previous week, sent from his deployment location. David had written about the challenging but rewarding work he was doing with international military units, and about how the lessons from their friendship continued to influence his own leadership style. David had also mentioned that he had shared Tank's story with some of the officers he was working with, describing it as an example of the kind of leadership that made the American military special. "He's doing incredible work over there," Tank told Maria, "making a real difference in how we train and support our allies." And apparently he's been telling our story to international military leaders as an example of American military values. Tank had been touched to learn that David was sharing their story with others. It reinforced his belief that the lessons from their encounter had broader significance beyond their personal experience. As Tank prepared for bed that night, he reflected on the remarkable journey that had begun with a moment of poor judgment on a training field at Camp Pendleton. What had started as a mistake, driven by prejudice and assumptions, had evolved into a friendship that had changed both men's lives and was now influencing military leaders around the world. The incident had taught Tank that true leadership required more than just military skills and commanding presence. It required humility, the willingness to acknowledge error, and the courage to put principles above pride. These weren't just abstract concepts, they were practical skills that made him more effective in every aspect of his military service. Tank's transformation had ripple effects that extended far beyond his personal growth. The Marines under his command had benefited from his more thoughtful and inclusive leadership style. Other leaders who had witnessed his public apology had been inspired to examine their own approaches to accountability and mistake acknowledgement. Military leaders who heard his story at conferences and training events were taking those lessons back to their own units. 6 months later, Tank received news that would provide a perfect capstone to the story. David Chen had been awarded the Bronze Star for his work in training international military units, recognition that highlighted both his tactical expertise and his exceptional leadership abilities. The citation specifically mentioned David's ability to build trust and cooperation between military forces from different cultures and backgrounds. Tank wasn't surprised by David's continued success, but he was deeply proud of his friend's recognition. When David returned from his deployment several weeks later, Tank was among the first to congratulate him on the Bronze Star. "David," Tank said during their reunion dinner, "I always knew you were destined for great things, but watching you achieve them has been one of the privileges of my career." David smiled, the same humble expression Tank remembered from their first real conversation months earlier. "Tank, everything I've accomplished has been built on lessons learned from people like you, leaders who weren't afraid to challenge me to be better than I was." As Tank looked around the table at David, Maria, and David's girlfriend Sarah, who had recently moved to California to be closer to him, Tank felt a profound sense of gratitude. What had begun as one of his worst moments as a leader had evolved into one of the most meaningful relationships of his life. The story of Tank Rodriguez and David Chen had become more than just a personal journey of growth and friendship. It had become a teaching tool, used in military leadership courses to illustrate the power of accountability, the importance of challenging assumptions, and the transformative potential of admitting when you're wrong. But for Tank and David, the real legacy of their encounter wasn't the recognition or the speaking opportunities or the professional advancement it had generated. The real legacy was simpler and more profound. Two men from different backgrounds had found mutual respect and lasting friendship through the crucible of honest acknowledgement of error and the commitment to learning from that error. Tank Rodriguez had called David Chen an idiot in a moment of prejudice and poor judgment, but in the end, that mistake had made both men wiser, stronger, and more effective leaders. It had demonstrated that sometimes our greatest failures can become our most valuable teachers if we have the courage to learn from them. The Marine and the SEAL had both been transformed by their unlikely encounter, and their story continued to inspire others to approach leadership with humility, integrity, and the recognition that true strength lies not in never being wrong, but in having the courage to make things right when you are.